Good morning. I'm Bruce Gellin, President of Global Immunization at the Sabin-Aspen Institute. I want to welcome you for joining us today at this webinar that's co-hosted by the Sabin-Aspen Vaccine Science and Policy Group, along with the Global Health Technologies Coalition. We're hosting today's timely discussion on the heels of launching a new report by the Sabin-Aspen Group, which examines the current vaccine R&D ecosystem and has some recommendations on changes to transform it to make it more nimble, more collaborative, more efficient, and overall more impactful. Next slide, please. I think that you're all Zoom, next slide, please. I'm sure that you're all Zoom experts by now and know how the functions work, but we want to have as much interaction as possible. So please submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can respond to questions or engage other participants through the chat function. And again, follow us along with social media at this link. And again, it'd be helpful to introduce yourself in the chat so we have some sense of who you are as well. Next slide, please. Probably this audience doesn't need to be reminded about the value of vaccines. And as this slide says, today the value has never been clearer. The Center for Disease Control several years ago highlighted that vaccines were among the top 10 health achievements of the 20th century. And vaccines are what the WHO refers to as the global health and development success story. And again, the value of vaccines has never been clearer as we're watching COVID vaccines being developed and rolled out across the world to try to slow down and stop this pandemic. Next slide, please. In that context, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Sabin-Aspen Vaccine Science and Policy Group. You'll see that they too have been familiar with Zoom, and this represents the meeting that we held last September. That was the basis of the report that was just released. The group, and if you can squint, you'll probably recognize many of the people. And if you can squint further and click on that link when you get it, you can go to the website to read more about the group and the individuals on the group. But they're made up of experts that come from across many disciplines that propose innovative solutions to vaccine-related challenges. This year, as I mentioned, like everybody else, we did this virtually, and we're pretty pleased with the conversation we're able to have. And you'll see that as evidenced by the report. Next slide. The Sabin-Aspen Group began 2 years ago with this collaboration between the Sabin Vaccine Institute and the Aspen Institute. We came together to try to have conversations around big issues in vaccines and vaccinations, whether they be domestic or global. In the past, this is our third report that was just released. We've had two previous reports, one in 2018 that was focused on accelerating the development of a universal influenza vaccine. And last year, the report was on vaccination hesitancy. I think what this signals, and the report today, as we'll talk about, is about the R&D portion of the vaccine and vaccination ecosystem, is that it's a large ecosystem. There are many pieces that all have to work together, and these are just some of them. Next slide, please. So the report that was just released is entitled Powering Vaccine Research and Development, Opportunities for Transformation. You all have links to it. I hope you have a chance to read it and continue to engage with us. But I will say that building on those previous reports and our previous conversations, the topic that we selected for this year on looking at the R&D component of the vaccine ecosystem was one we selected before COVID was anything that anybody had heard about. We had our meeting in the fall, and we had that meeting in the context of watching the pandemic and watching the rapid development of a number of vaccine candidates. And while that informed our discussions, I think it's important to signal that this is not a report about the COVID-19 vaccine race. That's clearly, it has shaped our discussions, but it's really looking more broadly across the R&D ecosystem, again, with the goal of trying to make things as efficient and nimble as possible for the benefit of all. Next slide, please. An overview of this is really trying to highlight why now. Again, we've all been impressed by the speed of the development of vaccines and how remarkably effective and safe they have been. But again, this is not only about what we've seen so far with COVID vaccine development. This is a thinking about how this is going to prepare us best for future pandemics, how we improve the efficiency, timeliness, and impact of this enterprise, and accelerate the development of next generation vaccines as well, not only vaccines for diseases that newly emerge. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, I think this is one of the takeaways. This is a quote from the report about recognizing that the components of the vaccine and vaccination ecosystem have served us well in many ways. The pressing threats are emerging in long-standing diseases, coupled with novel science and technology, allow us new opportunities, and we should take full advantage of them for the benefit of all, and to more rapidly produce the vaccines that we need in the future, and the vaccines we don't yet know that we're going to need in the future. Next slide, please. And while we've examined this ecosystem and on a number of topics, and I'll get to the recommendations in a second, I wanted to give you some of the context for these discussions. And the idea that again, I won't read all these, but these range from the moral imperative of vaccine access to the value of public confidence in the R&D process itself. These are, again, the things that we're seeing really every day with the COVID story, but apply more broadly to vaccines for a number of different diseases. Next slide. And so here's the spoiler alert, and this is hopefully you'll read the report and read into these things. But I just wanted to review just for a second these big ideas that this group created as a result of our discussions. Probably some of these aren't a surprise when you take a step back, but I think that singly and then together, they offer huge opportunities for these transformations of the ecosystem that we think can lead to some of these changes. Importantly, defining roles and responsibilities and establishing mechanisms of accountability. Many things came into place because they had to, but more in an ad hoc way. And let's make sure that in the future we can take advantage of what we've learned so far, and to ensure that all those who are part of the ecosystem know their role and know how to best work with other parts of the ecosystem. Building on our influenza report from a few years ago is also recognizing the need for transdisciplinary research that brings people together from different disciplines to solve problems. Often people might not know that they have a solution to a problem because they're not a, quote, expert in that field. But we think the more that there is this multidisciplinary problem solving, the more we're going to get to these aha moments of transformation. There was a large discussion about regulatory science and the needs for harmonization. That clearly speaks to an issue that we're also seeing now, but will make the system more efficient. That related to the vaccine development process is to take a fresh look at clinical trials, again, for more efficiency and nimbleness. We've all been hopeful that we'll see correlates of protection that we can then measure, that will then simplify and shorten and the complexity and timing of timelines for vaccine development. That I think offers new opportunities for the future. And then finally, the other big idea was let's position vaccines as a public good. We know that there are some incentives are not necessarily aligned, and the more we can align those incentives, the better coordination and collaboration we can have. Next slide, please. So with that introduction to the report, and hopefully you've had a chance to at least glance through it, I'm pleased now to turn to Jamie Nishi, the Director of Global Health Technologies Coalition, who will facilitate a discussion with an incredible group of people. So I will let Jamie take over for now and introduce herself and the panel. But again, thanks for joining us for this important discussion today.
Thank you, Bruce, and congratulations on the report launch today, or I guess it just launched yesterday. Again, I'm Jamie Bay Nishi. I serve as the Director of the Global Health Technologies Coalition, a coalition that works to advance policies around global health research and development of drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, and other medical products for use in low-income and low-resource settings. Our community spend a lot of time, including one of our member organizations, the Sabin Vaccine Institute, talking about the ecosystem and how we connect the dots on a lot of the moving parts of global health R&D. So I'm really delighted to be here today to facilitate this conversation with an incredible group of thought leaders and experts in this space. I could spend an hour just introducing our panelists today, so I'm not going to do that. I think our colleagues will be putting bios in the chat. But just to sort of frame things up, I mean, I think one thing is for certain, COVID-19 has put R&D front and center in global health conversations. We saw last week that the Immunization Agenda 2030 launch included a specific component for research and innovation. And when it comes out next week, we anticipate that the independent panel for preparedness and response recommendations will also include a focus on R&D and so many other places as well. So again, I think it's really timely that Sabin and Aspen were able to pull this collaboration together and launch this report when they are. And I think, you know, Bruce noted it, but that this project started before COVID struck, taking that fresh look at the ecosystem for vaccine. And then of course the pandemic hit and we all asked, where are the tools we need when we need them? And I think this collaboration at that point took on new meaning. So for today's conversation, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into these 5 big ideas and get feedback and responses from our panelists. And then we want to hear from you. We've got people introducing themselves from all over the world. And you'll see that there's a Q&A function built into your Zoom today where you can start to ask questions. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about the 5 themes, and then we'll want to hear from you in the Q&A in the second part of the meeting. So with no further ado, let me introduce our panelists, and I think we'll stop sharing our screen so you can actually see their faces live. Thank you. First up, we've got Dr. Kundai Chinyenze, the Executive Medical Director from IAVI, based in Uganda. We've got Dr. Penny Heaton, the Chief Executive Officer of the Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute, and she's also a member of the Sabin-Aspen Vaccine Science and Policy Group. We've got a person who needs no introduction, Dr. John Nkengasong, the Director of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And last but not least, Professor Helen Rees, Executive Director of WIT's Reproductive Health and HIV Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and also a member of the Sabin-Aspen Vaccine Science and Policy Group. So welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for dialing in early and late to be here with us today. Again, rather than going through formal introductions, we've got your bios posting in the chat. And my first very important question for you is it okay if I call you all by your first names so we can jump right in and have a really
Absolutely.
Yes, it's fine. Thank you.
Easy first question, knocked out. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So let's dive in. We want to anchor into these 5 big ideas presented by Bruce a couple of minutes ago. The first one is looking at recommendations to define leadership roles, responsibilities, and mechanisms of accountability to prepare for R&D demands that surface during a pandemic specifically. And I want to ask some questions to specific people, but for this one, I want to ask all of you your thoughts. We've seen that COVID-19 vaccine development has shown us the power of global collaboration to launch a new vaccine quickly, right? Most of us never would have imagined a year ago or more than a year ago that a COVID vaccine could be developed this quickly. What partnerships have you seen emerge during this COVID vaccine process that we should leverage, that we should strengthen and formalize in the future to propel the development of new vaccines for other health areas? And then just noting that several of you on our panel are from sub-Saharan Africa, I would also really love to hear more about regional partnership efforts that are being led and how, the COVID experience may be a game changer for some of those partnerships to flourish. So who wants to jump in on that first? We didn't plan it. I get to put you all on the spot.
Yeah, so let me go first so that when I make my mistakes, Helen is always there to correct me and clean the mess up. So let me make 2 points here. One is that for R&D demands during pandemics is challenging from where we sit, from the part of the work that we sit. I think I always remind the policy, you talked of leadership here, so let me start with what I usually remind the political leadership of our continent and policy, that you do not dig your wells when you are thirsty. You dig your wells when before you get thirsty. So in other words, you don't develop strengthen your health system when you are in a crisis or a pandemic. They should be there, and it should be very deliberate that you're doing that for us. So R&D from where we sit, from the section, part of the world that we sit is almost considered as a luxury. Something that if we will do the other things, and then if we have some change, we put it into some academia or research institutions to research. After all, we are not very sure of what will come out of that. I think the COVID, this situation is telling us that it cannot be that going forward. It has to be more deliberate, and we have to see that as an investment, not a cost to our own health security. And I use the word very, very deliberately, and perhaps national security. I mean, what we are seeing now in playing out for COVID-19 in India suggests to me and to all of you that this thing is not over, that it is not over until it is over. That is, and we as a continent must take that very seriously. And that's why I use the word transition from the word health security to national security. If what is happening in India happens here in Africa, then it becomes a national security threat for us, not just human security or health security. So what kind of partnerships and sharing that a partnership there, one has to be a partnership with the private sector in Africa must step up and to say that we need to work together so that we improve and enhance this space, the space of investing in R&D for vaccine security, which will lead into human security and of course our national security needs and economic security issues very clearly. Second is the sharing. You have to share. That is one thing that we have to learn from this crisis, that the power of sharing as humanity, we will only survive if we share. I mean, we share technology, we share knowledge, we share existing reagents, sequences all the time. Those are the fundamentals and underpinning for our own R&D to grow. I think those are some very early lessons that I can reflect on that COVID-19 has brought to bear, and in a very painful way for a continent that has been reminded over and over that HIV brought the same pains to the continent. The swine fever outbreak in 2009 brought the same pains, and now we are living with these pains. And just to conclude, from the part of the world that I see as a continent, we are mobilizing. We just 2 weeks ago had, 3 weeks ago, indeed had a very successful a conference on vaccine manufacturing on the continent that dealt with three things. One is the research and development, research into it, then second, development, and then lastly, manufacturing itself. Those are all three ingredients that must all come together if we have to advance in that space. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was a fantastic conference. Thank you again to your colleagues who organized that. It was incredible to hear so many leaders coming together to talk about that side of the ecosystem. Who wants to build on John's points? Partnership, COVID. Helen.
I'm only building because John said I had to. I'll perhaps just extend on that and just to think, that we mustn't reinvent the wheel. After the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, we said some of the same things. We said we weren't ready. We were late to the field in many instances with clinical trials because we had to design them almost from scratch. We hadn't got things easily and readily available in terms of vaccines on shelves, etc. And several things happened as a result of that. And I think that momentum needs to be built on, but we shouldn't forget it. And one of them was the development of the WHO's R&D blueprint, which was really trying to look at what could some of the priority research issues be and what are neglected areas. The second one was the establishment of CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. And the idea there was indeed to build on John's point about public-private partnerships, but also to mobilize global philanthropic funds, bilateral donor funds, to mobilize funding, and then to ask the question, what are the priority pathogens that have been neglected that have epidemic or pandemic potential? And a number of pathogens were defined, things like Lassa and Nipah and MERS. But also what was also defined there was the threat of pathogen X. And for that, CEPI invested in platforms, vaccine platforms. Now, there's a lesson to be learned here, because when SARS-CoV-2 occurred, CEPI was indeed able to use all of those experiences quite rapidly to stimulate vaccine development. Now, I'm giving the example of CEPI. There were many other public institutions globally who also did this. But what I'm saying is, I think that we need to look at what have we done before and what do we need to really build on. The other thing, though, I think that we need to really recognize, which is coming out as a weakness, and again, speaking from the African region, but also for other low middle income countries, is that when things get hot, people revert to type, and we go straight back to strong Western countries to lead the R&D process, partly because big pharmaceutical agencies are there, but partly because that's our default of safety. And I think we need to move forward so that in future, when things get hot, we have another button that we can press that says all countries of the world who have developed the R&D capacity, including low middle income countries, need to contribute. I think one figure I saw, for example, from the African region was a few months ago, that of the published papers that we've seen in R&D around COVID, only 3% had African authorship included. So that's the kind of thing that we've done some things well we should build, but we've missed some things, we've recognized them, and we need to move forward with those.
Perfect, thanks. And we'll come back to your comment about not reinventing the wheel and platform investments for sure in a second. Kundai.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. So I think there's been a great example of showing, what already exists in terms of not reinventing the wheel and leveraging those systems to sort of address this pandemic or any pandemic that may come up. So we have the example of the NIH clinical trials networks that were set up for HIV prevention research. They were very quickly leveraged for COVID prevention. And you saw clinical research centers, not only in the US, in South America, but also in Africa as well, sort of being able to be leveraged and come together to be able to contribute in evaluation of vaccines. And so that was a great example of something that actually happened during this process. And when you think about that, what happened with the COVID prevention network, the CoVPN, you look, for example, in Africa, representation in Southern and East Africa, but you see that there's a gap, for example, in West Africa and Central Africa. And so research not really being done in those parts of the continent. So it's really important to begin to leverage other groups beyond the NIH networks, including, networks through the EDCTP, for example, or others that are by other academic institutions that are spread across the region, whether through MRC, through other USAID supported networks, and working with broader groups to ensure that there's global representation. We're able to test and evaluate these products across, all the globe per se, not just specific parts of the continent. And then we have examples where I'll give one example in Uganda, where you had the MRC, UVRI, London School of Tropical Health and Hygiene, where they call the MUL, where in partnership with Imperial College, sort of looking to evaluate an mRNA vaccine. And so you have those sort of bilateral sort of partnerships that are happening and can very quickly be leveraged, in a much bigger scale, that are happening regularly. And so in this time in between pandemics, really looking at all these resources that exist in the continent and begin to bring together these partners, these resources to begin to talk together, so we have an understanding of what already exists and what can be leveraged in a pandemic situation.
That's perfect. And I'm going to come back to you in a minute to talk about clinical trials in a little bit more detail, since that's one of the big ideas. But Penny, could you close us out on talking about partnerships first?
Of course, yeah. So just to build on what the others have talked about, we talked about partnerships between, governments and the private sector, partnerships across clinical trial networks, the CEPI example. But one thing we haven't mentioned that I think has been really important for this pandemic is the private partnerships also. If you look at pharmaceutical companies actually collaborating with each other in a way that I have never witnessed before, and especially on the manufacturing front. And there's two advantages to that. One is obvious, one may not be so obvious, but the obvious one is obviously we need enough supply for everyone to have COVID vaccine globally. So it provides the possibility of that supply. But the second potential advantage, especially in the monoclonal antibody space, but also in the vaccine space, is you can really start to improve the efficiency of manufacture and bring down costs and improve affordability. So in thinking about, private sector companies in high income countries, tech transferring to private sector entities in low income countries, with the examples being, private sector companies tech transferring to companies in India, how can we keep stretching that, going back to what John and Helen said, and have that possibility of that happening in other regions of the world, on the African continent, et cetera? How can we really blow that out so that it becomes a much bigger effort in peacetime as well as for pandemic preparedness?
That's great. And I'm glad you mentioned monoclonals, not just the sort of traditional vaccine space. I think that's a really active debate in our community of how to make those investments, even though we know it's so hard. So let's dive into the second recommendation. As Bruce mentioned, the second one is focused on propelling a transdisciplinary research effort to expand and advance vaccine science and create two-way learning opportunities between research focused on pandemics and long-standing endemic diseases. And, yes, we've started the conversation talking about COVID. Of course, it's the elephant in the room. But many of you on the phone, your careers were not based on COVID, right? It was based on HIV research, TB, malaria. In fact, I looked back at a WHO report from 2020, noting that when you look at the top 10 causes of death in low-income countries, on that list remain malaria, TB, and HIV. So my next question, I'm going to ask John, and then since Ellen likes to follow up to John, we'll ask you both together. How do we ensure we're advancing R&D and investments in R&D capacity strengthening in a way that's not an either or between pandemics and longstanding health challenges? John.
So that is a very good question, and I think let me build on what Penny said about preparing during peacetime to get ready during wartime meaning during a pandemic. My mantra in all of this has been that, and this is irrespective of whether you're dealing with a vaccine or for HIV, is that the best way to prepare for the unknown is to adequately prepare for the knowns. The knowns that are affecting us on the continent is HIV, TB, malaria combined. They kill about 1.2 million Africans a year. Again, excuse me that I'm bringing the discussion home because, as I've said multiple times, your seat on every issue is, or your stand on every issue is where you sit. So I will naturally gravitate towards where I sit, and that is no respect of the fact that these challenges are global. But again, best way to prepare for the unknowns is to adequately prepare for the knowns. And that's the picture of, COVID has killed about in excess of 120,000 Africans in about 1 year and 3 months. HIV/AIDS, when this is all said and done, excess mortality from HIV/AIDS will probably be in the 500,000. Just excess mortality from HIV/AIDS. On Saturday, we Africa CDC and the African Union have convened an emergency meeting of all ministers of health to come in together with President Cyril Ramaphosa as the COVID champion, who was elected in that position by his peer after the remarkable leadership that he exercised last year, together with President Tshisekedi from the DRC. So on Saturday, we'll be looking at the situation in India and asking ourselves hard questions of what does that mean for us and how do we prepare the continent for that. The only reason I bring that up is that we have to look at this from a position of what is it that we can do to address those challenges that we have all the time on the continent, that will be grounded in developing vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics for those, so that when you get to this situation of the unknown, you can actually repurpose and reprogram and position yourself to quickly move upward. I think I wanted to use the word I am against, but let me find a better word. I think I'm not of the opinion that we should be having standalone structures for pandemic and outbreaks there. They should be grounded in the challenges that we face every day. I'll say this, and I would like that. I mean, you started off by poking us and saying all of you came from HIV. Of course, I mean, when I was in HIV, and I did that for 29 years, and I thought that the whole world had to work in HIV, and I didn't. I felt sorry for anyone who didn't work in HIV, and so. But that was my career at that time. I had to set up all kinds of vertical systems across Africa, and today I'm fighting against those vertical systems and trying to find ways to dismantle them so that they can be more horizontal. It's just where you sit all the time is influenced, and nobody could have advised me otherwise in my former life that those systems did not necessarily work well for this kind of things we are looking at. I'll give you one example and I end there. I'm a biologist. I mean, I've been doing that for 2 years. And it never occurred to me, and I co-chaired the lab technical work group for PEPFAR for 13 years. And it never ever occurred to me that Africa conducts about 100 million HIV tests a year, and there was no company in Africa, no country in Africa that produced a simple rapid test. A simple rapid test that can be as easy as this, where you put antigens on a stripe, and then you do a droplet of blood, and then you read that. None. And we do that. We've been doing that for 40 years. And I think those are the kind of things that we need to step back and fix. I mean, and if we did that, and you have the culture of doing that, then you are hit with the unknown, disease X. Then it's a question of repurposing our thinking and applying ourselves to the R&Ds that will produce us the test that is required for that immediate need. So that means, again, just to leave that point by saying investment in the current challenges will be the best way to prepare for the unknowns.
Thanks. Ellen.
So I think building on what John has said, a few years ago here at the University of Witwatersrand, we established something called ALIVE, which stands for the African Leadership in Vaccinology. I was going to say excellence, but it was in vaccinology effectiveness. And what we did there, before we even got anything going, it was multidisciplinary. So we took everyone who was a lab scientist through to a clinical and social scientist. But before we got anything going, we did a survey of the African region, and we said, who's doing vaccine research in the African region? And we tried to map it, and a lot of it was clinical research. And it was influenced, of course, by things like HIV, TB, malaria in terms of vaccine research. But then we categorized into which are the sort of really strong standalone, led by senior scientists, standalone entities, which are those that are working very, but are being led by African scientists, but very strongly influenced and managed, if you like, by Western academic institution, and what are sort of almost like specific to just a particular program and project. And there's what we found was there quite a lot of study sites that were really quite specific to a particular program. So they were dedicated to a particular program, a particular study or set of studies, and quite limited, and were really doing the work, the hands-on work. Then there were quite a lot that are partnering Northern Hemisphere institutions and led by Northern Hemisphere institutions quite strongly. And although there was leadership, it was still very much seen as a Northern Hemisphere sort of institution in the region. And there were very few that were truly African, indigenous led, etc. So I think the first thing that we've got to think about is how do we change that sort of narrative. The second one is, and it happened again with COVID, is we saw this with human papillomavirus research. When that vaccine came to be registered early on, they hadn't done any of the clinical trials in the African region, for example. So by actually, what we're doing is we're doing a global disservice by not actually embracing every region of the world and every setting. So I think that was a second sort of thought that about this issue of capacity building in peacetime. So one of the things that we did from the ALIVE point of view is we did two things, and I think this is some ideas that we could build on. One was that we set up a master's in vaccinology for the African region in particular. But the other one was that we're setting up networks, not only with Pan-African sites and scientists, so we can start to set up African-led networks. And this would be obviously strongly linked with the African CDC, but also talking now to colleagues in the Far East who also have vaccine centers of excellence, so that we start to cross-fertilize. It's not in any sense to exclude the strength of our Northern Hemisphere partners, not at all. But it's to try and sort of level the playing field a bit, instead of being the operational hands, to become the equal partners. And I think that is something that we need to spend more time thinking about how we do.
That's great, Helen. And I think there are a lot of conversations swirling right now that I observe about these hubs, centers for excellence, and who's doing the training and between whom. And I think that's something that needs further discussion and coordination, because there's a lot of different stakeholders thinking about their own hub models, and these need to be more coordinated, more integrated, and led by low and middle income countries in particular. You also talked about clinical trials. So let's switch to the third recommendation. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to ask all of you about all of the 5 big ideas. We'll have to speed this up and jump around. But the third one is on reimagining clinical trials to feature equity and efficiency as prime drivers, with low and middle income countries as full partners in clinical development at every stage. And I am going to go back to looking a little bit at sort of the global environment and then come back to your point, Helen. So Penny, sitting at GMRI, I mean, what are some examples, or even before you landed in the role you're in currently, that you've seen of current or past vaccine clinical trials with true partnership between low and middle income countries and high income countries to date? And again, I'm going to come back to the low and middle income country specific piece, but let's start there.
Yes, so I wish there were so many of these types of partnerships that we couldn't count them all, but I'll just share a couple with you that I've been involved with directly. And I am going to go way back to early in my career. The first example, I think, with the rotavirus vaccine program, that was chosen by GAVI with funding from the Gates Foundation for accelerated development in low and middle income countries. And so a group came together that included the WHO, the US CDC, PATH, and GAVI to do studies in low income countries. And it was complicated because there was a safety issue with the vaccine. The efficacy differed in different regions of the world. So it was complicated. But people came together, they did the studies in the mid 2000s, and WHO pre-qualified 2 of the vaccines from GlaxoSmithKline and Merck in 2008, 2009. And then with further collaboration, 2 Indian manufacturers were able to develop rotavirus vaccines that have also been WHO pre-qualified. And, the impact of that has been enormous. I mean, rotavirus deaths have been, and just for those of you who may not know, rotavirus is the leading cause of diarrheal disease deaths in children. They've been cut in half since introduction of the vaccines. They're still dropping, and hospitalizations for gastroenteritis worldwide have been reduced by somewhere between 30 and 80%, depending on what region of the world you're in. So, this idea of the power of partnership and global solidarity, it's very real. I mean, it saves lives. I know everyone on this call knows that, but we can't forget that. The other example of collaboration between low and middle income countries, I think, is what we're witnessing right now. Particularly, I think about COVAX and that collaboration between CEPI and GAVI and the World Health Organization for equitable distribution of vaccines. But if you look at the clinical trials setting, it's because of the studies that were done in South Africa, in Brazil, in areas outside of the US and EU that we understand the efficacy against variants, that we could start to have some benchmarks. It's because of that amazing work that was done that has enabled us to understand the evolution of this virus and the immunology of this virus in a way that we just wouldn't otherwise understand it. And so I think that's just been a really important example. And, you know, and what that is doing is that is supporting COVAX in their goal of, you know, getting all 20% of populations of all of the countries that are involved, getting them vaccinated by the end of the year. You know, I think we have to continue to build these kinds of partnerships globally. I just said that COVAX is going to, you know, the goal is 20% of, you know, the populations in the 190 countries by the end of the year. That's a big delta. And, you know, the most vulnerable populations, they're the ones that are falling into that delta. So how can we do, you know, put this on steroids and put together partnerships that help fill in that delta, be it for COVID, be it for TB, malaria, HIV, et cetera. We believe, you know, all lives have equal value. We have that ingrained in stone at the foundation, literally, and we need to work hard every day to try to turn that belief into a reality and continue to partner in innovative ways to fill these gaps.
Thanks, Penny. And John, I'm not going to ask you to speak to this because we don't have time to get in, but I just want to call out also the Africa CDC's work on the Consortium for COVID-19 Vaccine Clinical Trials. Yes. I mean, I think that's an incredible partnership that's been stood up. And I think we need to, maybe we can, as we answer follow-up questions, think about how that could be leveraged or replicated in some ways, and thinking about how do you maintain models like that for health areas in the future. Yes. And actually, Kundai, I'm going to ask you to jump in on that. I mean, I think that Penny also mentioned the complications of tracking, you know, running the clinical trials, thinking about safety and efficacy. What efforts can be made now to prime clinical trial sites and national regulatory agencies so they're able to respond faster in the future?
I think John put it perfectly. To borrow from his quote, to prepare for the unknown, you need to adequately prepare for the known. And really, it's you don't really develop systems for pandemic responses. It's really going down to the basics and making sure that existing clinical research sites are able to address existing issues, whether, you know, communicable or non-communicable diseases, and to conduct that research. So having human resources that are well trained within basic science research, you want your scientists, your clinicians, your epidemiologists to be very well trained, have appropriate data management systems and quality systems in place. These are critical systems that have to be strengthened through times of peace, as others have stated, and then they can now be rapidly sort of leveraged when needed. And, you know, what we have learned is, you know, it's really critical to engage communities at local levels, but also making sure that you are linked, you know, also across the region, so that you can come together and begin to address and engage the global and regional communities throughout the development process. And we do have regions that are sort of being left behind in clinical research, and I keep coming back to sort of West Africa and Central Africa and so, you know, other parts of East Africa, that we really need to make sure that they are very well strengthened in their responses, and ensuring that the investigators in these regions, the African investigators, are empowered to prioritize research questions, and they are capable of, because they understand the context and the regions that the responses that are needed for the local context, that they are able to put together research questions. They're empowered to do so, and when it comes to a pandemic situation, you can rapidly deploy these systems, these experts, to address issues as they come up.
That's perfect. Thank you. And, you know, you mentioned regions being left behind, and Helen mentioned the same thing, R&D being advanced, where, you know, stakeholders in sub-Saharan Africa are not being included in clinical trials. And something I've observed lately is that around clinical trials, sometimes product developers are waiting to advance a product because they really want to get in a certain clinical trial site because they know it's good and that it's well regarded and it's got a great reputation. And so when we think about bolstering clinical trials capacity, Helen, I would love to hear your thoughts on sort of how do you balance the efficiencies of scale that might happen if you run, you know, multiple health area trials in one general location or in one research institution versus the need to diversify locations of trial sites to have that sort of additional benefit of health services reaching new and additional populations. I think Kundai's example of it, just West Africa, the same capacities don't exist as are in South Africa, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, and I think that this is a real challenge because one of the issues with peacetime, and I think everyone has experienced it, is that if you set up networks and you don't have sufficient products to be evaluated, etc., you have to think how you sustain networks of clinical trial sites when you don't have a throughput pipeline. So for example, with HIV vaccines at some stages, there just haven't been a lot of vaccines to feed in to a huge pipeline. And it's very difficult then to sustain very focused clinical trial sites. So, I mean, one of the things to think about is, do we need to rethink this? And it'd be interesting to see how John is thinking about this now, so that we have pluripotent clinical trial sites that instead of being very, very, say, disease-centered focused, that we actually start to say, if we have the infrastructure that is set up, as Kundai said, with all of the necessary expertise and skills, if we have set that infrastructure up, what do we put into it? Is it just a single disease? Is it going to be a malaria supercenter, or does it start to become pluripotential? The other thing that we haven't mentioned, which I think that we also need to think about, is setting up expertise for other groups. So one of the things that's come out very loudly with COVID, for example, is our persistent failure to generate data on pregnant and lactating women. And so just about every time we bring anything to market, it says there is insufficient data to talk about safety. So you as a practitioner must do this at your own risk. And now there's been a huge discussion. It was ongoing before, it's even been accelerated now, to say how do we build pregnant women into, not just in an emergency setting, but how do we start to proactively think about pregnant women? And in the vaccine space, we've already started to think about it with things like RSV and Group B strep and so on, that are particular diseases of concern for pregnant women and their unborn children. But I think that there are sort of other things that we need to think about target populations. Older people is another group that we're seeing some of the vaccines, we simply don't have enough information. So I think that in addition to thinking about pluripotential clinical trial networks that have a chance of them being sustained in between pandemic crises, with very important questions being answered, but also different population groups that we should start to think how we focus.
Perfect, thank you. And John, Helen mentioned you in her response. Did you want to add on that in terms of thinking about how these clinical trials capabilities are structured or improved moving forward?
Yeah, I would just say, be very, very brief, because I have to run, we should be looking at a multi-purpose platform. I mean, I believe, and I might be totally wrong with this. And there are some examples that we can emulate. What the EDCTP, that is the European Developing Countries Clinical Trials Platform, has done, I think is, in my mind, a very good platform to emulate in several dimensions. One, the leadership of those networks, clinical trial sites, is really African-led. And it's also African initiated or originated. Ideas come from there, because most of the time, what I would say is goodwill tends to kill, inadvertently so, because you conceive something, and I've been a victim of that, where I sit some part of the world and I think, this is a wonderful idea, and you'll be welcome with two hands. And then, of course, when you come in and you say, well, I have $10 million to support you to clinical trials, even if it is not that country's agenda or that investigator, the tendency is to say yes. And then for 5 years, then the ground dries out, then those sites remain without support. So that is, what I mean by, but at the origin, it was a lot of plenty of goodwill, but that wasn't really thought out. So in brief, there are some examples that we should be looking at very, very what are called good practices. No practice is without limitations, but I think the EDCTP approach has been, to me, very, very good. So I need to apologize and run off because I have to jump into another preparatory call in the next 6 minutes.
Can I ask you maybe for a final couple of questions then, and then we'll backtrack to a few things for a deeper dive, if that's okay.
Yes.
Can I ask you a quick final question? Again, noting that that Africa CDC led this incredible manufacturing conference a few weeks back. There's the clinical trials capacity strengthening, but obviously a lot swirling right now about COVID, manufacturing strengthening, and beyond. A lot of what we heard during the African Manufacturing Conference was talking about maintaining warm bases of manufacturing in all of these places. But I think warm bases not meaning you pay for it and it sits underutilized, as you've just described in the example of clinical trials, right? How do you maintain that utilization and really ensure, investments are made for manufacturing capability that might be leveraged for other health areas? It's not just a one-off for COVID. So I was wondering if you could give us, as we think about end-to-end product development, including manufacturing, how should we encourage national and national governments, multilateral bodies to be driving these investments in manufacturing? And then we'll let you sign off.
No, sure. Very good questions, and in two ways. We have to see supporting regional manufacturing in Africa as part of the contribution to collective planetary health security. Because we just don't know where the next challenge will be. And if, see what we are going through with the India situation, where COVAX had based a strategy for Africa and India with the AstraZeneca vaccines, and see what is happening there in none of their fault. No one could have predicted that. So I think that, so that is at a very high level. That is a collective security. We mean we decentralize our manufacturing capabilities and find a way to, and ask ourselves the question that how much have we spent? How many billions and trillions have we spent in trying to respond to the pandemic versus if we had spent just a tiny little fraction of that in trying to collectively keep those facilities warm? And there's no lack for demand. We as a continent consume 25% of global vaccines. We import 99% of those vaccines and produce only 1% of vaccines. It's just so obvious that, it's not even a question. So when I hear people even ask that question, I say, well, there you go again. That means we are not learning anything from this pandemic. We don't want to write nice reports from this pandemic and then share them in good journals like the New England Lancet and others, and then down the road we visit them and it's the same thing. We know what to do. It's just that, there's usually, and any year, there's usually no glory in prevention. When we prevent things, people don't see that, that it was value in doing that. But when we react to things, people see value in that. I think that mindset challenge has to be changed so that we see that collectively we can truly say, look, there's political goodwill on the continent. At least 3 heads of states were at that meeting. They're all expressing strong commitment to manufacturing. That means if you go to Dakar today, I meet with President Macky Sall, or to Rwanda, meet with President Kagame, or South Africa, Ramaphosa, I said, look, we need this set of incentives from you to be able to set up a vaccine manufacturing that I'm sure they will say, yes, 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 they tick all of those boxes there. So I think the opportunity is now, and we need to act courageously, but act differently and start with our own mindset challenge. That says that we'll ask all the questions, know all the answers, then we go do those things. We will not. We'll be faced again with another response situation where we are throwing in trillions of dollars into things that you could have fixed with just millions of dollars.
Thank you, Dr. John Nkengasong. We know you have to go, and we're so grateful you were able to take the time to join us today. And we know you are in the thick of it. So thank you for all you are doing. We're all so grateful and huge fans and supporters of everything you're leading at Africa CDC. So thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Kundai, for being on the panel. I'm really apologies that I have to run. They're shouting at me already to join. So bye-bye.
All right, thank you. Be well. And for our other panelists who are still with us, I'm going to go backwards now. We talked about clinical trials, and then I had to ask that question about manufacturing before John left. But let's go to the middle of that. Let's talk for just a couple of minutes about regulatory, and then I know people are burning questions or adding up in the Q&A feature here, so we'll need to get to those shortly. But we can't not talk about regulatory, and so and that's the fourth big idea, is looking at restructuring regulatory science to reflect advances in vaccine R&D to make vaccine trials faster, nimbler, and more cost-effective, as well as to enhance product scale-up and manufacturing and post-market surveillance. And I mean, John touched on it briefly. I think a few folks mentioned that it's expensive. It's hard and expensive to run the clinical trials, but then going to that next step into the regulatory approvals. Kundai and Helen, I'm wondering if you can very, very quickly, because we need to keep moving, talk about how do we do that through regulatory capacity strengthening? Kundai, if you could go first.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. So I think in brief, critical areas that are needed include regulatory science expertise on the continent. We really need to increase the rate at which we are training our regulatory science specialists across Africa, because the availability of these experts in all the countries would be an enormous help to allow rapid review, not only of clinical trials, but also approval of products. And some of the work that's being done, great work through the AU and the Medicines Regulatory Harmonization initiative across Africa, and potentially sort of, I think, the planned African Medicines Agency that is being proposed. All these have great potential to strengthen regional and national regulatory approaches, and they do deserve greater support and investment to bring them to reality. And I think the final thing is just increasing the partnering with other agencies across the regions, like EMA, the US FDA, and the WHO. You know, it would be critical in sort of cross-learning and sharing of information as needed.
Perfect. Thanks. Helen, do you want to build on that?
Yes. Well, I think I'll be a bit harsher. We have very good intentions, and certainly post Ebola, AVRF was established in the African region, and there are also in other regions these sub-regional or regional efforts where regulatory authorities are coming together, and that is really happening. Secondly, regulatory authorities worldwide have been strengthened in the last 10-15 years. We've seen a real emphasis on regulatory strengthening. But and I chair the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, the board of that. So I see this, what I still see very strongly happening repeatedly and time again, is the default is to go to the FDA, to go to the EMA, to go to the MHRA, to go to what are called these stringent regulatory authorities. And then after there's been a whole discussion and a whole set of things agreed, then coming to the LMIC regulatory authorities. And I think that we have to fundamentally challenge that. It's not helpful, because at its you know, at the least, it's not building capacity. But what if there is a disagreement in how a clinical trial should be designed, especially with these new clinical trial designs? So I think that we need to find better ways early on in the development, in the regulatory pathway, to have joint discussions where everyone is around the table who's likely to be involved, for example, in clinical trials or in the registration of a product. And then similarly, once we get to licensure and things like pharmacovigilance, we're not good yet, I don't think, at sharing that information sort of seamlessly and rapidly. So the idea of reliance is first class and excellent, but in the next 5 years, the global regulatory world has to work out how we do this in a more seamless manner.
Again, I think we need an hour with you two and others to really dig in on this. And I think we should ask Sabin-Aspen and GHTC to maybe have some follow-up conversations, because we need to focus on this a lot more and think about what coordination is needed there. So thank you both on that. I'm sort of keeping off the Q&A, and there's more questions showing up than we'll probably have time to cover, but I do want to take at least 2 minutes to talk about the fifth big idea, which is to position vaccines as a public good and align incentives so that benefits accrue to all sectors of society, including a strong push to develop or maintain policies and practices that promote information sharing. And I'd actually like Penny and then Heaton, Penny, Heaton, and then Helen to talk about two different sides of that. Penny, could you talk a little bit more about the range of incentive mechanisms that have been applied to incentivize global health R&D of products, particularly when those commercial markets fail? How do you fill that gap? How do you sort of drive the incentives to stay engaged in this really hard and expensive R&D amid all of those challenges? And then Helen, I'm going to ask you to speak to a different piece of this, which is thinking about the role of information, data, and sample sharing, and ensuring that vaccines are being regarded and treated as a public good in the future. So totally different questions, but under this big umbrella of public goods and aligning incentives. And I think that some of the questions we're already seeing in the Q&A also build off that. So we'll go to you two and then switch to the public Q&A.
Great. Yeah, so thanks. I think one of the key lessons that we've learned from COVID is that the great benefits of vaccine development in the pharmaceutical sector, they have to be fully offered to everyone. It's not just a matter of equity and justice, but it's actually prudent, especially with communicable diseases. It's about our livelihood. It's about economic prosperity. And I think that's just really important. There are a lot of incentives that have been used to get the private sector to participate in this space, working against diseases that don't have the traditional market forces, whether it's corporate social responsibility, impact investing, financial incentives for neglected diseases, et cetera. But I think the one that seems to have been most successful to date is one that's being used in COVID, and that's the advanced market commitment. And what that is, if you're not familiar with it, is to actually give some assurance of the demand, how much volume of vaccine would be purchased, and that usually comes at a pre-specified price, even before the phase 3 efficacy and safety results are known. And what that then allows is for manufacturers to go ahead and scale up their manufacturing and have capacity to produce sufficient supply at risk. And then assuming the phase 3 safety and efficacy results are favorable, then you can have doses that are ready to ship as soon as regulatory approvals are received. And that's been used, not just with COVID, but with pneumococcal conjugate vaccines. It's estimated that nearly 1 million lives from pneumococcal pneumonia were saved because of the advanced market commitment. So we need to really be thinking, though, I think, about other incentives as well. As John was already talking about, how do we incentivize, manufacturing in the region where the diseases are? At the Gates MRI, we're working on malaria, monoclonals, TB vaccines, TB drugs, et cetera. And we're working with both private and public sector partners. These don't have traditional markets. So how can we innovate and think about ways to bring them forward? I don't have all the answers. This is actually an old problem, but I think one of the lessons of COVID is that we have to partner and figure it out. And, I just think about, we have this little 4-pound helicopter on Mars that's sending pictures down to us. And if we can do that, surely we can figure out, how to develop the right incentives so that interventions for these diseases that disproportionately affect the poor or other communicable diseases that affect everyone, that they can be addressed globally.
Great, thanks, Penny. Helen, over to you on information, data sharing, and tons of questions coming up in the chat, of course, about IP sharing as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with sample sharing. And data sharing. I think very early on, when the Chinese authorities shared the genomic sequence for the Wuhan strain, it was incredibly important. Excuse me. It was an incredibly important innovation that really changed the trajectory of what we were able to do with vaccine development. However, since then, I'm certainly aware of the fact that it's not always easy to share samples because of country regulations and bylaws. And when that happens, for example, now that we've got variants, what we really need to be able to do is to share samples, to share biological samples, so that we can actually, we're actually able to evaluate in different parts of the world with different vaccines, with different populations, what in fact we are seeing. And that we're seeing that there are blocks there. And these are some of the things that we need to look at. And we perhaps need to be part of a new global response, as you say, to pandemics, that we start to try and remove that. In terms of data sharing, I think that one of the difficulties here can be that when you have private sector, it's very difficult, even if you're a clinical trial site and you have you're collecting your own data, that you don't get that data. That data is very much protected by the sponsor. Now, that's not always the case, and particularly in the public philanthropic sector, people will allow clinical trial sites to collect data and to ask secondary questions. But in the private sector, it's not always the case. And so again, I think we need to sort of say, what should be a norm going forward in terms of data sharing? And that goes with IP, which I'll come to, perhaps we should all talk about. But in terms of the other thing, I would just say that I think that we need to really look at hard now is pharmacovigilance and information sharing. Because I think, for example, we're hearing often about potential, whether they're real or not, adverse events, but through the media. And then countries have been asked to respond about an adverse event with the vaccine through the media, through a media report, not through any official coordinated response, which ideally should be focused, in my opinion, through the World Health Organization. That really should be set up to really look and assemble. It has been set up to assemble all the safety messages. But again, that information sharing is not yet seamless, and we need to work more on that. I won't say anything about IP. I'll leave that back to you at the moment.
Okay, well, I also want to make sure we've got some really insightful comments that are in the Q&A, not necessarily questions. So I'd like to highlight two of them. And then Kundai, I'd like to ask you a question that I see here about clinical trials and ethical committees. But we've got a first-year PhD student at the University of Ghana who'd like to make a contribution, saying that I think African researchers should be funded to get trained in Africa. The more you stay in the region, the more problems become real, and the more you stay tuned into solving them. And I think that was a theme that we've heard across the big ideas today, is how do we have more African-led initiatives, including thinking about workforce training, thinking about that technical expertise along the end-to-end research spectrum. So just wanted to say yes, and I think that really jives with a lot of what we've heard in today's panel. Also, we've got a comment from Peter here saying, really enjoying hearing about the comments, ideas about developing infrastructure and expertise, but he hears a lot of wheel reinvention here, or invention here. 2 points. Isn't it better to support research sites to be multifunctional, like IAVI in Tanzania, and keep developing more sites? Second, we at Scenaria have been absolutely committed to developing a strong research consortium, which involves trial design, execution, and analysis with many African partners. So just showcasing that there are these collaborations happening, and great to see another example of that there. And then that gets into a question that we did get from Natalie, who's asking about clinical trial facilitation. And can you briefly comment on ethical committees networks on the African continent? And Kundai, I know that IAVI really has expertise in running a lot of clinical trials, so maybe you could start there, and anyone is welcome to chime in.
Yes, so similarly, like the regulatory piece, you do have sort of very different expertise in terms of ethics, capacity for ethics review across the continent. Very strong in parts of the region, not as strong in other countries. And some of the challenges that are related to maybe just the systems that are available that they use to review, for example, just having to review hard copies versus using online platforms of virtual systems that allow things to move seamlessly across reviewers and have comments being back on time. So this is another area I think is sort of part of just thinking about that regulatory sort of piece. And that's another group that also needs support and capacity strengthening. And you know, the question then comes in, who are the appropriate individuals to sort of support this? Whether it's through national instruments or through independent groups or sponsors sort of in some way supporting these mechanisms without in any way sort of influencing some of directly influencing the work that they're conducting on the continent. But this is definitely an important area that needs to be looked at in terms of trying to ensure that across the board, you have good standards that are not so that people don't go sort of ethics committee shopping in countries where they feel things will move quickly and will probably not be reviewed appropriately and just have protocols approved. So this is an important area that also needs to be looked at.
Perfect, thanks. Penny or Helen, do you want to build on that, or shall we move on? And actually, just realizing that we have 3 minutes left, I have to apologize to everyone. I don't think we're going to get into the level of depth that is due for a conversation about global public goods. There's questions about technology transfer. There's questions about IP. I think we need a whole day, much less an hour, to talk through some of those.
Yeah, if I can just in
Yeah.
1 minute, the
Yeah.
IP thing, I think it's a really tough issue, but I think what I want this audience to understand is the layers of the onion with that issue. There's first the IP, then the second layer is actually the know-how to actually manufacture a vaccine. That takes certain talent, et cetera, that's and know-how that's not covered by the IP. Then there's the supplies chain issues right now that they're having with making vaccines, and as well as the facilities to make the vaccines in. So it's a very multi-layered problem. And I think it goes back to John's comments earlier about, we really need to look very carefully at how we incentivize tech transfer and manufacturing capacity building regionally. So just to throw that in and layer actually a few more questions onto the top of the question that was asked.
It's hard. It's hard. And I think that, and then even thinking about some of these technology transfer questions, there was a question in here that was talking about what can we learn from, for example, the Global Action Plan for Influenza Vaccines as one relatively effective coordination mechanism at a global level, and thinking about how we apply that to health preparedness. And I think actually, Bruce Gellin, if we can ask you to turn your camera back on and perhaps have the last word as we wrap up today's conversations. I think of you as the guru of all things seasonal influenza. Maybe you could make that linkage about sort of influenza, looking at health preparedness, and just noting the fact that you've started this journey of this collaboration with Aspen and Sabin, looking at vaccine R&D because of concerns that it was trending down, that this was going away, or that it was not going in the right direction for the gaps in health areas that we all look at, and then looking to COVID and now looking to the future. Are you optimistic or pessimistic? So a two-part question as we wrap up, and over to you.
I think it's about a 20-part question.
Sorry.
So overall, you have to be optimistic. I think that what we've heard today is incredibly rich discussion. Just for a second on influenza, we recognize the threat of influenza. A pandemic is looming, and now we're seeing how other problems can actually feed into what we're going to do for influenza and vice versa. So I think that's a place where there's some fusion. There's been thinking for a long time about influenza, and now there are going to be lessons that community can learn from what's going on now and beyond that. I do want to stop for a second and just as we're coming to the close, Jamie, I want to thank you. You had an impossible charge to wade through these 5 very important but very distinct areas that the group came up with, and they did that intentionally because they recognized that these were things that, as John said, didn't need to be written about but needed to be acted on, and the actions are going to have to take place beyond today into very different sectors. So I think you've begun that conversation, and I think it's like the beginning of a series, and I think we're going to have to think of how we bring each of these forward, not just for deeper conversations but for actions. I will say that this discussion today was a flashback to the discussions we had that went into this report. You can imagine with the people who were involved that what we heard for an hour today was an example of the kinds of rich discussions we had about this topic, about the vaccine R&D ecosystem, recognizing that that's only a piece of the larger ecosystem. We didn't get into surveillance, and obviously the importance we talked about here of, as Helen mentioned, about making sure that we know what's emerging and we can share those. We didn't get into the last mile issues of the delivery and ensuring what we're seeing now, equitable delivery of vaccines, and the beginning of a program to deliver vaccines across the lifespan, And the last part of that mile is how people make decisions on what they're going to do. So it's a huge, complex ecosystem. We tried to focus in this report on those segments of it. And we're glad that you were able to generate this incredible conversation with an incredible group of panelists. And I hope that for all of us and all who dialed in today, this is the beginning of a longer conversation. So I want to thank you all for all of your attention, the many questions, including those that we didn't get to, and let's continue this conversation. So on behalf of the Sabin-Aspen Vaccine Science and Policy Group, the Sabin Vaccine Institute, and the Aspen Institute, and Jamie, you and the GHTC, thank you for this very rich discussion. And thank you for the panelists who we could keep for a much longer time than they have time for. So thanks again for everybody.
Perfect. Thank you all. Thanks again to our panelists. We're really grateful for your time. And if folks haven't checked it out, you've got it on the screen share there. Read the report. Thanks, everyone. Stay well and to be continued.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.